What is sociocracy? How does it relate to what goes on inside corporations? How can that go wrong? Could this be used in a bigger societal context in some way? These are all questions I would like to address today. And where I want to go in this video is, first of all, what is sociocracy? And I want to approach this from the standpoint of someone who is a sociocracy enthusiast, and she will be a manager inside a corporation, because most of the literature on sociocracy does relate to corporations, and I think there's going to be a reason for that. But she wants to apply this notion of sociocracy to society more broadly. And of course, this interests me because I'm thinking about governance systems of the future. And I really do believe we're going to need different styles of governance systems that have checks and balances on each other. So could this be one of those systems that operates in an ecosystem of different governance styles? So we'll look at, why is it reasonable for her to be an enthusiast? How can sociocracy go wrong inside these corporations, and how could it lead to even corruption by committee inside corporations? What are going to be the roadblocks when Manager Mary tries to implement this on a broader societal level? And then we'll try to give her credit where credit is due. How could this be part of an ecosystem of governance systems? So first off, what is sociocracy? So there will really be three parts to sociocracy. The first is going to be small, trusted groups who develop an understanding of each other over time. They develop a group dynamic over time, and they're comfortable with each other. So in a corporation, this would be like your department. The second feature of sociocracy is sort of the way this moves in toward the C-suite of a corporation, where you have representatives of each of these smaller groups sort of at the bottom, if you're going to map it onto a hierarchy. They have a representative that comes together in a bigger group with representatives from each of the small groups. So this is basically like middle management. It's groups of middle management. And then each of those groups of middle management send representatives to essentially like the C-suite, the more centralized part of the corporation. That's how it works. And of course, at every single level of this, you're going to have people who develop a group trust and a group understanding over time. And the notion is that ideas can move from the edges of this thing, where people have good ideas about how to solve problems, and they move in toward the center, where management can actually implement those ideas at a higher level. Now, the last feature of sociocracy is that it focuses on consent rather than consensus. So consensus is an agreement among everyone. It's like we all agree that this is what the group should do. Whereas consent is different. Consent is like, I don't know if I agree, but I'll consent to give that a try. So at the smaller levels, you might imagine the group of, say, 12 people who know each other really well. They're presented with a problem, like the company has this problem. What might be some solutions? They might brainstorm. Somebody might have an idea, and they might say, would anybody object to me trying this idea? And people might have objections, which they might talk about, but the goal would be to have some idea that they say, okay, we all consent to you trying that idea. So those are the traits of sociocracy. And you might imagine Manager Mary is somebody who operates at different levels in this group. Like maybe she's even the person who represents a small group and then takes that to a bigger group and then takes that to the C-suite. So there's a lot of things she appreciates about this model. In particular, she believes you can get good buy-in from people when the ideas come from trusted groups. And she really loves the consent-based discussion, because it means you can try really risky and creative ideas, and you can get ideas that bubble up from the bottom that will get attention from the managers if these middle level groups are like, wow, that's a really good idea. We all consent to that being tried. Now, how can this go wrong, and how can it turn into corruption by committee? And groupthink is basically where a group comes together, and before they've spoken, there might be independent beliefs about something. But once the group starts to talk, they tend to move in the direction of one opinion, that they get stronger and stronger toward that opinion as the group discusses. And there's social aspects to this, like the group moving in a certain direction might have to do with personalities or social dynamics within the group. that have nothing to do with the validity of the idea. And there is evidence that groups sometimes become more and more extreme, like they don't merge toward the middle opinion among all of the opinions that came in the door. Oftentimes they do merge toward extreme opinions. And you might imagine part of the reason for that is because the people with the strongest sort of social force in any group might be the people with strongest viewpoints. So groupthink is always going to be a risk anytime you have these small social groups that form cohesion among themselves, where they care about validating each other's ideas and agreeing, and they care about sort of the social dynamic and making sure it's good. And you might have heard of these experiments where people come into a room and there's one experimental subject and a bunch of actors, and they're asked the question, which of these lines is the longest? And the actors all give the wrong answer. One by one, they're asked, what's the longest? They give the wrong answer. And finally, when the experimental subject comes up, the experimental subject will oftentimes give the wrong answer that everyone else gave as well. So that's a common phenomenon, and that groups kind of wield that dynamic in a way that can be good or can be destructive. So groupthink is part of the story. Another part of the story I think was alluded to in this book, which I did a book review on in the middle of the summer. I was obsessed with this book last spring. In the middle of this book, he actually makes the argument that we should stop conceptualizing corporations as hierarchies of this structure. He said actually a better way of thinking about how corporations work is with these centrifugal circles that look basically exactly like the sociocracy diagram. He said we should stop talking about higher versus lower in corporations and instead should talk about closer to the center or closer to the edges of corporations. And when he said that at first, I was like, why does it matter? These two are basically the same thing. You have people at the bottom here or people at the bottom here. Like those are the same thing. But I've started to understand his point. And one of the points he wanted to make is that power has shifted from sort of the top of an organization to the entire organization as a whole. So that ideas from important engineering departments and important marketing departments within this whole organization can come up and they can work their way to the center through something like a sociocracy. And then they can work their way out where that power did not necessarily come from the CEO or the C-suite. The power came from the engineer who had a strong opinion with the social dynamic and the need for the corporation to sort of make each of these people on the edges of this feel okay or feel like they have some say in what's going on. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Because in some ways, people at the edges have a really deep understanding of the on-the-ground work that they're doing. And you actually do want to empower these people to be able to contribute their ideas to the cause. Like the whole bean counter versus car guy analogy is that people who understand cars are oftentimes at the edges of these departments in these companies. And when you have the bean counters, the CEO suite people who come up with metrics that aren't really related to the real value of car making, you get problems. And I think sociocracy addresses those problems by empowering people along the edges. So it's not necessarily bad. But here's something that I think happens, which is that you've got groupthink at every level. The groupthink sort of works its way into the center. The C-suite people in the center sort of amalgamate the groupthink, and then they impose it in the same way you would impose ideas over in this hierarchical structure. They're like, okay, there's groupthink that we've centralized. Now let's work our way out by getting the managers who have built trust with people to get on board with some groupthinky kind of idea. And they may do that in a way that's sort of pretending that it's not imposing ideas when it really is. And so when ideas sort of work their way to the center through a groupthink process and then are imposed in a way that's pretending not to be imposing them as they work their way out, I think that's where you can get corruption by committee. And this will be especially true if there are ways that the organization as a whole can do things that support the in-group at the expense of an out-group. And I mean, classic example of that would just be a bureaucracy that had the goal of expanding how many people were in the organization so that more of these people could implement their ideas, which is something people love to do. And that's not necessarily bad. But if the funding of this bureaucracy getting bigger and bigger is crowding out other things in the economy, then I would categorize that as corruption. Okay, so sociocracy can be good, it can be bad, but Manager Mary has seen the best possible version of sociocracy, and she wants to implement it in broader societies. So what is the first problem she's going to run up against as she tries to come up with a way of implementing this? And I think the biggest problem here is that how do you get people to show up to the outer groups? Like in a corporation, they have to show up because it's their job to show up. Like they have to attend these meetings where they develop trust and dynamics among the people they work with. But you're not going to have the general populace be willing to show up to meetings like that without paying them in some way. Now, paying them might be an option on the table. I mean, that would be a very weird situation, but I think we need weird ideas. But I think how these groups are determined is less clear. Is it random? What if people in the group just don't get along? Can you rejigger it? Is there a certain type of person who ends up in a group? Would that create biases? So there are a lot of questions about the formation of these groups. If it is entirely voluntary to show up to these groups, you're not going to get the same kind of buy-in or group consent that you might want if you want the population to consent to implementing new ideas. Also, if it's entirely voluntary to show up to these groups, you might get people attracted to the groups who want to implement their ideas. In which case you could get more conflict when it comes to which ideas are we going to promote to move up the chain. Now, how might this actually work in a governance ecosystem type of situation? And I probably would not support the whole population being forced into these groups, even if you are paying them. I have some worries about the way that would work out because, of course, the power dynamics in corporations where this happens, those power dynamics are weird. They might favor people with certain social skills. I think there are issues with this in general. But I could see this working well in certain specific situations where you've got a problem to solve. And maybe that problem is designing a school system, or maybe it's solving some other problem that's come up in the community after a natural disaster, for example. And you have a bunch of people who are like, hey, I would like to work on this problem. I care deeply about it. I'm willing to be a workhorse on this problem. And I also have some thoughts. In which case you could get an opt-in situation where everyone was committed to the cause. And I think that sort of situation, if you have all the people who are willing to put in some time and hours, and maybe that's the admission ticket, is like, if you're going to sign up for this, you have to put in some hours working on behalf of other people's ideas too. Then I could see something like this actually being good at getting creative ideas implemented and prototyped.